Our conversation continues with Harun Ndubi, co-convener of the Kenya Tuitakayo Assembly, telling us the Kenya Tuitakayo Assembly is basically a coalition of civil society and civic actors to come together and talk about reimagining the Kenya that we'd like, the ideal country that we'd like to have. And it's important to keep having these conversations. Now we are at another moment of conversation, right? So this time we are calling it bipartisan. The president says, let's have bipartisan talks in parliament. Yesterday, the Azimio leadership said, yes, let's have the bipartisan talks, but let's moving out of parliament. Let's have it like the Koffi and Annan talks of 2008. What do you think of that?
Interesting question, because what does bipartisan mean? It really means of two sides.
Yeah.
And who is defining these two sides? It's the politicians. They want to be the ones talking about us as Kenyans. It is important that Kenyans lead that conversation. If the conversation is beginning from the demonstrations that we have seen in the past few weeks, talking about the cost of living and electoral justice. Those are issues that affect Wanjiku. Those are Wanjiku's issues, and they do not belong to the politicians. The politicians, we must remember, as institutions, whether they are in parliament or not parliament, but let me emphasize more of the ones in parliament. Theirs is to make law. They have been given a mandate to make law so that the law suits what Wanjiku wants. It's not that they are the ones to think for us. By the way, they must be reminded that the act of election or voting did not amount to a surrender of our collective intellect as Kenyans. So they must not assume that they know more than we do, that they are the ones who know what to do about us. So that if they are discussing questions that affect Wanjiku, we should be the ones leading that conversation as citizens, and they should be listening more than talking between themselves. In fact, these are two people who sit together at night to negotiate for who eats what part of the cake at what time. But they are not, they exclude the people from whose sweat the cake is baked. So it is important that whether we are calling it bipartisan euphemistically, or they mean that it should be held in parliament, that I think shouldn't be part of the conversation. The conversation about whether they are sharing power or not, this it's a red herring, I think, that Kenyans are being fed with, that some politicians want to trivialize the Wanjiku issues by christening the demands for those issues as a desire for a handshake. It might as well be a desire for a handshake, because I'm not talking on behalf of the Azimio people who have been the ones leading these demonstrations. No, I'm saying probably they have spoken the language of Wanjiku, because people who are hungry it doesn't matter whether they are in Azimio or Kenya Kwanza or other, or partyless. When you are hungry, you want food now. So if there are people talking about how we make this food available, let us have that conversation without necessarily looking at who is speaking for whom. Sorry, I think I'm confusing the point I'm making. That the politicians themselves were elected to go to parliament, but that did not mean that they are the ones to think for us. The second point is that it is important to note that these politicians seem to have betrayed the aspirations that we talked about earlier in the Constitution, and that's why we do not trust them to speak for us. In fact, those politicians, especially if you look at the ones in office now in parliament, whether in Kenya Kwanza or in the opposition, they are themselves interested in sustaining themselves in those positions, and probably interested in getting more power and more privilege. So that if we are going to have a conversation, we must have that conversation involving all of us. Again, reminding me of what Muga asked earlier about what fight should we have. We do not have to have a fiscal fight. like we tried to do in 2007 and 8. We now need to have an intellectual or a fight of ideas so that we can have a conversation. That's why we have the right of expression and respect of each other's dignity, so that we can exchange these views without necessarily having to fight. So that now we need to define those questions, whether what kind of society are we truly, and what society do we want to be as Kenyans? What are the things that make this country unequal, so that we can now start dismantling those barriers that are, prohibiting citizens from achieving their full potential, and enacting or providing the ladder for growth of those citizens who need to achieve their potential as well. So that is the conversation we need to have, and that conversation cannot be led by politicians alone. I would like the politicians to understand that they put together as members of parliament or elected leaders, as politicians, they belong to one category of our society as those who are elected politicians in that institution. So even if they call it bipartisan and they want to talk between themselves, that's basically like you and your wife and children having a conversation in your house.
It's the same household.
It's the same household that is talking. So we need a conversation where neighbors, and in this case, I mean that the citizens who are neighbors of these politicians, because we have seen how they conduct themselves. Remember, I was asking why they give themselves loans. Why is it that you go and the first thing they ask for? You remember Wetangula, the first statement he made when he was elected speaker was to say, let these new members get loans to buy houses and cars. You give them, you put them into privilege immediately, and they become beholden to you, and they are no longer beholden to the Wanjiku who elected them.
But then, Harun, I've got to ask you, so what do you make, what's your reaction to the Azimio proposal now that you have it like the Koffi and Annan talks of 2008? Is that a better approach?
Kenyans are very optical, let me say. A lot of times Kenyans discuss issues by way of examples. And the misfortune that brings is that people start deviating from the issue, and they start discussing the relevance of the example. And before you know it, another example is given of that irrelevance, and they continue and get lost off track completely. So what I think that maybe the Azimio leadership should have said, or what we need to be saying as Kenyans, is that don't even call it Koffi and Annan. Don't we have minds of our own? Don't we have ideas of our own as citizens? They needed to say we must have a structured conversation which involves all citizens, and let's allow these citizens to have their own formations. And we have timelines of creating those formations for populating the ideas to bring them to some level where now we can sit down and say this is the conversation.
But they did not say that.
They didn't say that.
That is by accident or by design?
It is possible by design, because like I've already said to you, Latif, these fellows are thinking about themselves, what is in it for me? Why do you think the conversation through politicians is either it's Ruto or Raila? They are not talking, they are personifying the Wanjiku issue into a Raila Ruto debate and making it a two-man debate rather than an issue for citizens and citizens' integrity. So I think it is possible by design, and because, after all, even the politicians in Azimio, these have been politicians for a long, long time. They know no better.
Even as you say that, a lot of times I'm always asking about the people and where do the people come in all of this. And here we are having this conversation. But I'm conflicted because at the same time, I think also a people maybe who are not regarded, because it's kind of like a chicken-egg situation. The people are not regarded because you've not heard their voice in the manner in which it ought to have been heard. But then also an environment needs to have been made conducive whereby the people then can agitate, So which one then happens first? You see where I'm going?
I hear you.
So
and
then
I think
the thing is, it's possible for somebody to be ignored or not even regarded because we've not heard you or seen you. There are some democracies today where you would never make the mistake of ignoring the people because they are fully vested and they are always keeping leadership on their toes. So come up with something like this. There's no way you're leaving them out
But-
because they're involved. My question is, we are saying involve the people right now with all of this, which absolutely is something that must be. How do we get to the point whereby leadership will not ignore you or will not see you as regardless? Because that's what it is for me.
Yes.
By the time they were having this bipartisan or whatever, they didn't even think, it was not even thought that perhaps we should involve the people. It didn't come to mind at all.
Yeah, certainly. I think partly I would, there are two elements I would say I attribute that issue or the situation to. One is how the people have been conditioned politically, and we have legal systems that have continued to entrench the power and influence and patronage of power, the powerful over poor citizens. And we have a leadership that has frowned upon citizen mobilization, where even having a meeting, previously we were required to go and get a license from the OCS. Now, we got, perhaps because our constitution was negotiated, we still have to go and notify the OCS. Why do I need to notify an OCS about a meeting of us talking like this as Kenyans? If you want to have a political rally at Uhuru Park, why inform the police? Of course, some people think that that's a radical question, but it's because there is a notion that already criminalizes free thought and a notion that criminalizes collectivity of people, that if you come together, you must tell the police because there is likely to be a breakdown of law and order. How does that come about? I already said things about the breakdown of law and order in the government offices. The making of budgets, where we make a budget and provide for corruption in it. It's a thing that I thought that the EACC should be investigating systematically rather than going, like my friend Ahmed Nasir once said, chasing traffic policemen and counting their teeth to see whether they have swallowed or not, or 20 shilling note. So what I'm saying is that let the people be free. The policemen, by the way, this notion of even going to report to the police is a fallacy because we have an intelligence system. The NIS collects intelligence every day, and even the plans that people have, whether it was the Azimios or Kenya Kwanza or UDAs and even myself and others, I know that they know what we think, what we say. So it is improper to cheat Kenyans that you have to inform us that you are planning for a meeting when they already know anyway. So let the people be meeting, let the people organize and assert themselves. Remember that conversation was held by it is in the Constitution itself. If you look at the preamble, it talks about the respecting of the people's sovereignty. That's a part in the Constitution, or Chapter 1, I think, that talks about the people expressing their sovereign will either directly or through elected officials. So there is a recognition of having a direct expression or conversation of their sovereign will. So this is what we need is having people to be woke, so to speak, if I use that language of Obama, so that people can start having these conversations out there.
Should a light switch on? Should there be something that happens? Because there are folks who, for a constitution, is not written down. It's the Brits. There's no written constitution, but there is that expectation that everybody knows, even if we don't write these things down, we know very well in our minds, whether you're a child in grade school or you're a practicing professional or you're somebody who is in parliament. Everybody has
it's a tradition.
Thank you.
Yes.
It's a tradition. It's in your psyche. You know what it is. We know what ought to be protected. We know how people ought to then be able to be communal, to be able to picket, to be able to agitate. And it's accepted across board, and it is expected then that you treat in a certain way and that you also be treated in a certain way. But something happened in order for that state of things to be. Do you think that switch needs to come on in these other democracies that we speak of, like Kenya today? And what would it take to get to that point where folks realize we don't have to write it down? You might as well toss it out the window. It's something you need to have.
Yeah, those Brits who don't have a written constitution are the ones who wrote one for us.
Yeah.
They took us to Lancaster to and write it for us in their own home, rather than conceding that, okay, you Kenyans have spoken, write your own constitution, do it for yourselves. We can be observers if we want to be. But you see, the question you're asking is interesting, because even the international community has an interest on how Kenyans behave. The international community is the greatest, especially the big 4 or 5 political formations, are the ones that are happy with the kind of leadership Kenyans have, because they are the greater beneficiaries. Look at our own elections. Why is it that we go looking for, where do we go to print ballot papers in Greece or in any other country, but we can trust ourselves with printing our money on Thika Road? These are the fellows who are extracting our minerals and taking them to their countries to use. We have, is it called titanium in the coast?
Yes.
Which is a very rare and highly valuable mineral. But we don't process it and use it. It is sold, and what Kenyans are getting is called royalties. You get royalties of a product on your soil, in your soil.
They even get it.
If they do. If they do. I assume there is, because I was engaged in some conversation around that.
It's a debt that we are told is in the treasury and will be paid.
Exactly.
Yes.
But the point I'm trying to emphasize is really that the structure of governance we have, irrespective of the wishes of Kenyans and how we goaded the government, and the government goaded us, because I said it was a negotiated document. So we agreed that this is how we want to live and live together as Kenyans. Yeah. But the structures that are up there, the elite structures, do not permit for the right of expression adequately. You will find people are giving acres of airtime, not the media, but even our leaders, whether they're church or faith-based leaders or politicians, to discussing a very trivial question of LGBTQ rights, especially the judgment of the Supreme Court. Yet, they cannot engage in a conversation of the structure of government or governance that we need to have in a country where everybody feels dignified, everybody is valued. You go to the Supreme Court. I don't want to be legalistic, because that I do when I'm in court. But you find there was a very interesting decision that the Supreme Court made that people have forgotten. In 2013, there were about 3 petitions that were filed, but of course the media and everybody focused on the Raila petition. But a fellow called Moses Kuria and Dennis Ndubi and a third person I forget had filed a petition which was upheld by the Supreme Court in a most unfortunate way, I think. What happened was this. The Constitution says a person to be elected president must qualify, must have obtained 50% plus one and 25% from a certain number of
counties.
Half of the counties.
But the 50% plus one of the
votes
cast. Ndubi and Moses Kuria went to court and said, no, spoiled ballots are not votes cast. Or the ones that are called stray ballots, where you might find you have put the president's ballot in a different box. So the right of expression of that voter who might have been illiterate or for any reason made a mistake, that expression of his wish or being part of the population of voters was completely discarded by the Supreme Court. The Supreme Court said here, so if the vote is improper, it is therefore not cast. So we are now talking about 50%
how do we know it is improper if it wasn't cast?
That is the question. We made that argument in court. We were beaten by the Supreme Court. It said no. If it is a bad ballot, it can therefore not be an expression, which is strange because in Zimbabwe, at some point when I don't know if you may recall, one time there was a repeat election that Mugabe called after there was a complaint by Changirai. The late Changirai, or they're both late. Yes. When Mugabe forced a repeat poll, people went and they were angry. The Zimbabweans were angry. They were just writing on the ballot paper, you are a pig. They were spoiling and insulting him. They were writing treatises of the opinion they were holding against Mugabe. But those things that was an expression of the people's frustration.
So was it counted?
Well, I don't know. What the point I'm trying to make is that that is an expression. The right to express yourself whichever way is a right that should not be taken away by the courts. Unfortunately, because what I would want to point to you is, had they taken into account of all the votes cast, Uhuru would never have been the president that time. We would have okay, he may have been. Sorry,
never. Yes.
He could have been, but we would have gone to a runoff.
Yes. That's a whole conversation that we can have. And actually, I stand on the other side. If it's a spoiled ballot, it's a spoiled ballot. Unless we say that we add something on the ballot paper that says, express yourself. And I would love that. So we can go there and say, none of the above,
Eric,
all of you are thugs.
Eric, I find it simple. If someone doesn't vote, then you cannot talk about a ballot. But the moment it is cast, that's when you know it is valid or not. But it has been cast. So at what point does it become uncast? At the time when you vote wrongly or the time when you vote?
What is casting?
How do you count? How do you count the votes? You hold it up and say Ndubi, and you put it on one side, Muga on the other side. This one that has both Ndubi and Muga, where do you put it?
But you are going to make a determination of what percentage did Muga or Ndubi get. And that percentage must take into account even that spoiled vote. By the way,
that's a whole debate.
Let me conclude that element by saying sometimes a vote of no confidence is an important vote also. Yes. Like my sister from Nigeria. What happened in the last election in Nigeria was basically a vote of no confidence because out of 93 million registered voters, you have only 8 million voting.
Yes.
It's a vote of no confidence.
Yep. Exactly.
Yep, it should count.
This is the Situation Room, the only way to start your day.